I always believed that love could survive anything. At 55, I thought I had learned all of life's hardest lessons. I was wrong. Some betrayals come wrapped in familiar voices, delivered by the very hands that once reached for yours in the dark. My name is Sophia, and I spent 33 years being someone's mother. Not just any mother, the kind who stays up all night when fever burns through small bodies, who saves every dollar for school supplies while wearing the same coat for 5 winters, who learns to be both father and mother when death steals half the equation too early. Daniel was everything to me. My miracle boy, born after 3 miscarriages that left me hollow and desperate for the sound of infant cries in empty rooms. When his father passed from a sudden heart attack, Daniel was only 7, I made a silent vow that this child would never feel abandoned, never question whether he was loved, never wonder if anyone in this world would choose him first. I kept that promise for 26 years, through scraped knees and broken hearts, through teenage rebellion and college anxiety, through every milestone that should have had 2 parents celebrating, but had only me, clapping twice as hard to fill the silence where his father's voice should have been. Our birthday dinner started when Daniel turned 8. Every year, on his special day, we would sit at our small kitchen table, just the 2 of us, and I would light the candles on whatever cake I had managed to afford. We would make wishes together, blow out the flames together, and for those few moments, the world felt complete despite its obvious cracks. He would tell me about school, about friends, about dreams that seemed as vast as the ocean. I would listen with the intensity of someone memorizing poetry, storing every word like precious stones in the vault of my heart. These weren't just dinners. They were our sacred hours, when the boy who was growing too fast would slow down enough to still be mine. Even when he went to college, even when his friends had parties and girlfriends had claims on his time, he never missed our birthday dinner. "It's tradition, Mom," he would say, sometimes calling from campus just to confirm the time. You and me, same table, same terrible jokes about getting older. And I would laugh because his jokes weren't terrible at all. They were perfect because they belonged to us. 26 years of birthday dinners. 26 years of being chosen, of mattering, of having a place at the table of someone's life. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to our work. And comment to let us know which city you're watching from. This year felt different from the moment Daniel called. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver news that will change everything. "Mom, about my birthday dinner. Alina wants to come too." Alina, his wife of 6 months. A woman I had met exactly 3 times, and each encounter had left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language in my own home. She was beautiful in that polished way that requires professional maintenance. Perfect nails, perfect hair, the kind of clothes that whisper about price tags I couldn't begin to pronounce. But beauty isn't what worried me. It was the way she looked at our small house as if she were calculating its deficiencies. The way she smiled without warmth when Daniel told stories about his childhood, as if his history before her was an inconvenience, rather than the foundation that built the man she claimed to love. "Of course she can come," I heard myself saying, though something in my chest grew tight and cold. "Our table always has room for family." The words felt strange in my mouth because Alina had never acted like family. She had never asked about the photos on our mantle, or shown interest in the stories behind them. She had never complimented the meals I cooked with such care, or noticed when I wore the one nice dress I owned to their small, hurried wedding ceremony. But she was Daniel's wife. And if being Daniel's mother had taught me anything, it was that love means making space for the people your beloved chooses, even when they don't choose you back. I spent 3 days preparing for this birthday dinner. I bought ingredients I couldn't afford, practiced recipes I had never attempted, cleaned corners of the house that hadn't seen attention in months. I wanted everything to be perfect. Not just good enough, but perfect. Because if Alina was going to judge our life, our home, our simple traditions, then I wanted her to see that love could create beauty even without money, that care could make magic even in modest spaces. I made Daniel's favorite cake from scratch, the same chocolate recipe his grandmother had taught me when I was younger than Alina is now. I set the table with the good china that usually stayed locked in the cabinet, The wedding plates his father and I had registered for 28 years ago. Still perfect despite decades of careful washing and cautious storage. The house smelled like celebration. Candles flickered on every surface. I had even bought flowers for the centerpiece, yellow roses that reminded me of sunshine and hope and all the birthdays we had shared when hope felt easier to hold. When they arrived, Daniel looked handsome and happy, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He kissed my cheek with genuine warmth, complimented the flowers, told me the house looked beautiful. For just a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything would be fine, that the strange distance I had been feeling was just my imagination, just the natural adjustment that happens when someone you love builds a new life. But Alina looked around our dining room like she was visiting a museum of quaint poverty. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they're being polite to distant relatives or tolerable strangers. She complimented the table setting, but her voice carried the same tone someone might use to praise a child's art project. Kind, but ultimately condescending. And in that moment, sitting at our table with the good china gleaming under candlelight, I felt something I had never experienced in 26 years of birthday dinners. I felt like a stranger in my own home, like someone who had been invited to observe a tradition that was no longer mine to claim. The conversation during dinner moved like a river around rocks, flowing, but with obvious obstacles that everyone pretended not to notice. Daniel talked about his new job, the promotion he was hoping for, the apartment he and Alina were renovating in the upscale part of town. His voice carried excitement I hadn't heard in months, the kind of joy that comes from building something new and important. But every story seemed to emphasize distance. The fancy restaurants they frequented, the weekend trips to places I had only seen in magazines, the social circle they were cultivating, people with advanced degrees and investment portfolios and vacation homes. As he spoke, I realized that our small world had become something he was moving away from, not something he was proud to share. "You should see their master bathroom, Mom," Daniel said, his fork pausing over the cake I had spent hours perfecting. "It has a soaking tub and separate shower, double vanities, heated floors. Alina found this amazing contractor who specialized in luxury finishes." I nodded and smiled, but something inside me grew smaller with each detail. Not because I envied their success. I was proud of Daniel's accomplishments, genuinely happy that he could afford things I had never been able to provide. The pain came from the way he described their life as if it existed in a completely different universe from ours, as if the modest home where he had been raised was now just a curiosity from his distant past. Alina barely touched her food. She moved the cake around her plate with delicate precision, taking tiny bites that suggested either dietary restrictions or simple discomfort with homemade desserts. When I asked if she was enjoying it, she smiled that same careful smile and said, "It's very sweet, Sophia. Very traditional." The word traditional fell between us like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of meaning I didn't want to examine too closely. Traditional meant old-fashioned. Traditional meant simple. Traditional meant the kind of life that sophisticated people had evolved beyond. "Daniel told me you made this same cake for his birthday every year," Alina continued, and there was something in her tone that made the faithfulness of that tradition sound like limitation rather than love. "That's consistent." Daniel laughed, but it wasn't the warm laughter I remembered from previous birthdays. It was the kind of laugh that creates distance, that says, "Isn't that amusing?" rather than, "Isn't that wonderful?" "Mom's always been predictable that way," he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. Same cake, same dinner, same everything. You could set your calendar by her routines. Predictable. The word echoed in my mind as I watched my son, the boy I had raised to value loyalty and consistency, reduce 26 years of devoted tradition to something boring and small. I had thought those yearly celebrations were evidence of my faithfulness, proof that some things in his life would always remain steady and safe. Now I understood they had become proof of my inability to grow, to change, to become someone worth impressing. "It must be nice," Alina said, her voice carrying that same polite distance, "to have such simple pleasures. Some people are just more comfortable with basic things. Basic things." simple pleasures. Each phrase was delivered with surgical precision, cutting away pieces of my dignity so smoothly that it took several seconds for the pain to register. I had been dismissed as someone who was content with less because she was incapable of achieving more. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that our traditions weren't simple by limitation, but by choice, that there was profound love in the consistency she was mocking. But the words stuck in my throat like cotton, dry and useless. How do you explain the sacred to someone who sees only the ordinary? How do you defend love to someone who measures worth in thread counts and square footage? Actually, Daniel said, and for a moment I felt a flutter of hope that he would defend our memories, our history, the woman who had given him everything she had to give. Actually, I've been thinking it might be time for some new traditions. Alina and I want to host holidays at our place from now on. We have more space, better facilities. We could do things differently. The word differently hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Different meant better. Different meant more sophisticated. Different meant without me as the central figure, without our small house as the gathering place, without the traditions I had lovingly maintained for over 2 decades. We could have catered meals, Alina added, her enthusiasm finally genuine. Professional service, proper wine pairings, the kind of celebration that reflects where Daniel is in his life now. More adult, more adult. As if everything we had shared, every birthday dinner and holiday meal and quiet celebration around our modest table, had been childish play that he had finally outgrown. As if the woman who had worked 3 jobs to pay for his college tuition was somehow less mature than the woman who had married him after knowing him for 8 months. I looked at Daniel, searching his face for some sign of the boy who used to hug me tight after every birthday dinner, who used to say, "Thanks for always making everything special, Mom." But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who was nodding enthusiastically at his wife's suggestions, already planning celebrations that had no place for the mother who had created every celebration he had ever known. "That sounds wonderful," I heard myself saying, though the words felt like betrayal against my own heart. "You should do whatever makes you both happy." But even as I spoke those supportive words, even as I smiled and nodded like the understanding mother they expected me to be, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was deeper than that. It was the slow, dawning realization that the person I had built my entire identity around saw me as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a treasure to be cherished. Daniel reached across the table and patted my hand with absent affection, the way you might comfort a child who is being brave about disappointment. "You understand, right, Mom? It's not that we don't appreciate what you've always done. It's just time for us to take over hosting duties. You've done enough for so many years. Done enough." As if love was a debt that could be paid in full, a responsibility that could be transferred to younger hands when the original bearer had served her purpose. As if 33 years of devotion had been a burden he was now graciously relieving me of, rather than a gift I had given freely and would continue giving until my last breath. I cleared the plates in silence while they discussed guest lists for their upcoming holiday parties. Names I didn't recognize, people from Daniel's new world who would never know that the woman washing dishes in the kitchen had sacrificed everything to help him become someone worthy of their sophisticated company. When they left that night, Daniel hugged me goodbye, with the same distracted affection he had shown all evening. "Thanks for dinner, Mom." The cake was nostalgic. Nostalgic. Not delicious. Not special. Not the perfect expression of love it had always been before. Just nostalgic. A pleasant reminder of simpler times that had been outgrown and left behind. The weeks that followed the birthday dinner felt like living in a house where all the clocks had stopped at different times. I kept reaching for my phone to call Daniel, then remembering that our conversations now felt scripted and careful, full of polite questions about weather and work that skimmed the surface of real connection like stones across water. I tried to adapt. God, how I tried. I bought new clothes, nothing expensive, but newer versions of my usual style, hoping that if I looked more current, I might fit better into the picture of the mother they seemed to want. I researched wines at the library, reading articles about varietals and regions, thinking that if I could speak their language, I might earn a place at their table again. When Daniel called to invite me to a dinner party at their new apartment, I felt a spark of hope so bright it almost hurt. "Just a small gathering," he said. "Some friends from work, a few of Alina's college friends. Nothing fancy, just good food and conversation." I spent hours choosing what to wear, settling on a navy dress I had bought for his wedding but never worn since. I brought a bottle of wine I had researched carefully, not expensive enough to seem like I was trying too hard, but not so cheap that it would embarrass them. I even practiced conversation topics, preparing questions about their careers and interests that would show I was engaged with their world. But the moment I walked into their apartment, I understood that I was not a guest. I was an obligation being fulfilled. Their friends were younger, polished, confident in ways that come from never questioning whether you belong in the spaces you occupy. They spoke in shorthand about mutual acquaintances and shared experiences, a linguistic code that excluded outsiders with surgical precision. "This is Daniel's mother, Sophia," Alina introduced me, and something in her tone marked me as different before I even spoke. Not Daniel's mother with warmth or pride, but Daniel's mother as a category, like saying, "This is Daniel's accountant," or "This is Daniel's dentist." Someone with a specific function, but no broader relevance to their real lives. I tried to join conversations, asking questions about their work, their travels, their opinions on topics I had researched, but every exchange felt like trying to catch water with a net. They would answer politely, then seamlessly return to discussions that didn't include me, their body language creating invisible barriers that kept me perpetually on the outside. "Daniel tells us you work at a grocery store," one woman said during a lull in conversation, her tone carrying the kind of forced interest people use when they're making charitable small talk. "That must be steady work, steady work." The phrase landed like a gentle slap, emphasizing everything unglamorous about my life while pretending to find virtue in it. I wanted to explain that I had worked at that store for 18 years, that I had put Daniel through college with money earned scanning barcodes and bagging groceries, that there was honor in honest work even when it didn't require advanced degrees. Instead, I smiled and nodded. "Very steady. It's given me flexibility to be there for Daniel whenever he needed me." The conversation moved on immediately, as if my response had been exactly boring enough to justify their lack of interest. I became a spectator at my own son's party, watching him laugh at jokes I didn't understand, share stories from a life I wasn't part of, play the role of successful young professional in a production that had no part written for mothers like me. During dinner, they seated me at one end of their long, beautiful table, close enough to be included, far enough away to make real conversation difficult. I could hear fragments of their discussions about restaurants I couldn't afford, vacation destinations I would never visit, career moves and investment strategies that belonged to a world I had never learned to navigate. Daniel glowed in this environment. He was funnier here, more articulate, more impressive than I had ever seen him. But watching him shine in this setting felt like discovering that the sun I had watched rise every morning was just one star among billions. Beautiful, but not uniquely mine. Significant to the universe in ways that had nothing to do with my witness or wonder. "Your son is amazing," one of Alina's friends told me during dessert, leaning in with wine-softened sincerity. "So smart, so driven. You must be incredibly proud." I was proud. Proud in ways that ran deeper than words. Proud with every breath I had taken for 33 years. But as I started to respond, to share even one small story about the boy who had become this impressive man, Daniel interrupted from across the table. "Mom, don't start with the baby stories," he said with a laugh that made everyone else laugh too. "She's got a million embarrassing tales about me as a kid. Very dangerous dinner party material." Everyone found this charming, the successful young man gently teasing his doting mother. But what I heard was a warning. Don't tell them about the real me. Don't remind them that I wasn't always this polished person you see tonight. Don't make this about you. So I smiled and stayed quiet while the conversation moved on to other topics. Other people's children, other stories that didn't threaten to humanize the impressive young professional they had come to admire. I became invisible in my own son's life, present but irrelevant, acknowledged but not truly seen. When they brought out coffee, Alina mentioned their upcoming anniversary trip to Italy. Daniel's never been to Europe, she said with the casual confidence of someone discussing a minor oversight that would soon be corrected. I can't wait to show him Florence, Rome, the Amalfi Coast. It's going to change his whole perspective on art, on history, on what's possible. What's possible? As if the life he had lived before her, the dreams we had shared, the future we had imagined together, had been limited by my small vision and modest means, as if everything beautiful he had experienced with me had been preparation for the real beauty she would show him, in places I could never afford to take him, with sophistication I could never provide. How wonderful, I said, and meant it, even as each detail felt like a small death. He's going to love seeing the world. We're thinking of making international travel a regular thing, Daniel added, his excitement palpable. Now that we have the income for it, why not? Life's too short to stay in one place. Stay in one place. Like I had done. Like the woman who had built her entire world around making one small place safe and warm and full of love for him was somehow limited, rather than devoted. Provincial rather than present. Small rather than sufficient. After dinner, as guests began to leave, I found myself alone in their kitchen while Daniel and Alina said goodbye at the door. Their refrigerator was covered with photos from their honeymoon, tickets from shows they had attended, invitations to events I knew nothing about. A whole life documented in colorful fragments, and nowhere in that collage was there any evidence that Daniel had existed before meeting Alina 6 months earlier. No pictures of his childhood, his graduation, our birthday dinners. No remnants of the life that had shaped him into someone worthy of this beautiful apartment and these impressive friends. It was as if he had been born fully formed at age 28, with no history to complicate his new narrative, no mother whose love had been unfashionable enough to require editing. When I finally gathered my purse to leave, Daniel walked me to the door with the same polite attention he would show any departing guest. Thanks for coming, Mom. It was nice having you here. Nice. Not wonderful, not special, not meaningful in any way that suggested my presence had added value to his evening. Just nice. The kind of word you use for pleasant weather or adequate service or acceptable food that doesn't inspire enthusiasm but doesn't offend either. As I drove home through streets that looked foreign in the darkness, I realized I had spent the entire evening trying to prove I was worthy of love I had never had to earn before. I had auditioned for the role of mother in my own son's life and apparently failed to impress the casting directors who now controlled access to his heart. The months that followed felt like watching myself disappear one phone call at a time. Daniel's calls became shorter, more functional, stripped of the warmth that had once made my heart leap every time his name appeared on my phone screen. Our conversations became reports rather than connections. Updates about work, weather, the kind of surface-level information you might share with a distant acquaintance. "How are you, Mom?" became a question with an invisible timer, as if he were already calculating how quickly he could move through the obligatory check-in and return to the life that actually mattered to him. When I tried to share anything meaningful, a memory that had surfaced, a worry that was keeping me awake, even something as simple as excitement about a book I was reading, his responses grew shorter and more distracted. "That's nice, Mom," became his standard reply to everything. My stories, my feelings, my attempts to maintain connection, all reduced to "that's nice," delivered in a tone that suggested he was multitasking, that I was just background noise in whatever more important activity was demanding his real attention. The holidays arrived like a scheduled execution. For 27 years, Thanksgiving had meant Daniel and me around our small table, sharing gratitude for the life we had built together from the wreckage of early loss. We would cook too much food for 2 people, watch football games neither of us really understood, and spend the afternoon looking through photo albums that chronicled his growth from baby to man. But this year, there was no invitation to their apartment, no suggestion that I might join their celebration. When I finally called to ask about plans, trying to keep my voice light and casual, pretending I wasn't desperately hoping for inclusion, Daniel's answer fell like a stone into still water. "Oh, we're doing Thanksgiving with Alina's family this year. Her parents are flying in from California. It's going to be pretty intimate. Just family, you know? Just family." The phrase echoed in my empty house for hours after we hung up. I wasn't family anymore. I was something else. Something adjacent to family. Something that had served its purpose and could now be filed away with childhood toys and outgrown clothes. I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time in my adult life. I bought a small turkey breast and made stuffing for one, going through the motions of celebration in a house that felt tomb quiet without Daniel's laughter echoing off the walls. I set one place at our table, the same table where we had shared decades of gratitude, and tried to eat while looking at the empty chair where my son used to sit. The silence was so complete, it felt aggressive, like a living thing that pressed against my eardrums and made my own breathing sound unnaturally loud. I found myself talking to the walls just to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own, cracked with the effort of pretending this was normal, that I was fine, that being abandoned by the person you loved most in the world was just another milestone to navigate with grace. Christmas was worse. I had always been the one who made Christmas magical for Daniel, staying up until 3 a.m. wrapping presents I had saved for all year, creating traditions that cost nothing but time and attention, filling our modest home with warmth and wonder that no amount of money could purchase. The tree we decorated together, the cookies we baked, the morning ritual of opening presents slowly, savoring each moment like it was made of gold. But when I called to ask about Christmas plans, Daniel's voice carried that same distant politeness that had become his default tone with me. Actually, Mom, Alina and I are going to Aspen for Christmas. Her family has a house there. It's going to be really nice. Skiing, fine dining, that whole scene. That whole scene. A scene I had never been part of, could never afford to be part of, would never be sophisticated enough to navigate even if I could afford it. He was spending the holiday that had always belonged to us in a place I couldn't even imagine, with people who saw Christmas as an opportunity for luxury rather than connection. What about our traditions? I asked, and immediately regretted the question because it made me sound needy and pathetic, like someone clinging to the past instead of gracefully accepting the future. Oh, those old things, Daniel said with a laugh that didn't sound cruel but felt like being slapped. We're kind of past all that now, don't you think? Time to make some grown-up Christmas memories. Grown-up Christmas memories. As if every Christmas we had shared had been childish play, as if the love that had animated every tradition was somehow immature compared to whatever sophisticated celebrations awaited him in Aspen, as if the mother who had worked double shifts to afford the bicycle he had wanted at age 10 was too juvenile to participate in the holidays of the man he had become. I spent Christmas morning alone in my living room, looking at the small tree I had decorated anyway, more from habit than hope, surrounded by wrapped presents I had bought for a son who wouldn't be coming to receive them. The gifts sat under the tree like accusations, evidence of a delusion I couldn't seem to abandon no matter how clearly reality contradicted it. The sweater I had knitted for him during lonely evenings, choosing colors I remembered him loving, working stitches that carried all the tenderness I couldn't express in our increasingly distant phone calls. The book of photography from places we had always talked about visiting together. Back when "someday we'll travel" was a shared dream instead of evidence of my limited horizons. The cologne I had saved for months to buy, the same brand his father had worn, chosen because I thought it might remind him where he came from, who had loved him first and longest. All of it meaningless now. All of it evidence of how completely I had misunderstood my place in his life, how thoroughly I had confused the intensity of my love for him with the importance of my presence to him. I called him on Christmas morning, just to hear his voice, to wish him well, to participate in his joy even if I couldn't share his location. But the call went straight to voicemail, and when he returned it hours later, his voice was bright with champagne and adventure, full of stories about powder snow and gourmet meals, and the kind of Christmas morning that looked like magazine spreads instead of memory books. Sorry I missed your call, Mom. We were out on the slopes early. This place is incredible. You can't imagine how beautiful it is here. You can't imagine. He was right. I couldn't imagine his world anymore because he had stopped describing it in ways that included me, stopped translating his experiences into language I could understand, stopped caring whether I could picture the life he was living without me. New Year's Eve came and went without contact. No call, no text, No acknowledgement that we had always spent that night together, making resolutions and sharing hopes for the year ahead. I sat in my quiet house and watched strangers celebrate on television, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life, present but not participating, watching but not truly seen. By February, our phone calls had dwindled to once every 2 weeks, then once a month, conversations so brief and superficial they felt like checking boxes on an administrative list. How's work? How's your health? How's the weather? Questions with no real curiosity behind them, answers that led nowhere, interactions that fulfilled the technical requirements of filial duty while carrying no actual warmth or connection. I began to understand that I was being phased out with the gradual precision of someone ending an uncomfortable business relationship. Not abandoned dramatically, that would have required acknowledging that I mattered enough to abandon, but simply allowed to fade until my presence in his life became so minimal that my eventual complete absence would barely register. The worst part wasn't his lack of love. The worst part was realizing that he had never seen our relationship the way I had seen it. While I had been treasuring every moment, building my entire identity around being his mother, creating meaning from what I thought was mutual devotion, he had simply been waiting to grow up enough to leave me behind. But I still had something they didn't know about, something they had forgotten in their rush to build a life that didn't include me, something that would remind them both that love isn't always quiet, that mothers don't always disappear without consequences, that some connections run deeper than convenience and can't be severed without leaving scars. Something changed in me during those long, quiet months. Not all at once. Nothing dramatic or sudden that might have been mistaken for breakdown or surrender. Instead, it was the slow, deliberate transformation that happens when someone who has spent their entire life giving finally learns the difference between love and self-destruction. I stopped calling Daniel first, not out of anger or spite, but from a growing understanding that my eagerness to maintain connection was enabling his casual dismissal of it. If our relationship was going to survive, it couldn't be sustained by my effort alone. So I waited, and learned that when I stopped reaching out, the phone stayed silent for weeks at a time. The silence was educational. It taught me that what I had mistaken for mutual love had been mostly my love, projected so intensely that it had created the illusion of reciprocation. Daniel had learned to receive my devotion the way some people learn to receive compliments, graciously but without deep consideration, as if unconditional love was simply his natural environment, rather than a gift someone was choosing to give him every day. I began spending my evenings differently. Instead of sitting by the phone hoping Daniel might call, instead of refreshing social media to catch glimpses of the life he was living without me, I started reading again, really reading, the way I used to before motherhood consumed every spare moment and transformed every quiet hour into time that could be spent worrying about someone else's happiness. I rediscovered the woman I had been before I became Daniel's mother. Not the young woman who had married his father. She was gone, claimed by grief and responsibility and the countless small surrenders that motherhood demands. But the woman I had become through 33 years of loving someone more than myself. Someone who had developed strength and wisdom and resilience without ever stopping to acknowledge her own growth. In the library, surrounded by books that contained every human story ever told, I began to understand that my story wasn't ending. It was finally beginning to include me as more than just a supporting character in someone else's narrative. I checked out books about women who had reinvented themselves in midlife, who had discovered purposes beyond the people they had spent decades serving, who had learned that identity could be larger than the roles others assigned them. I started taking walks through neighborhoods I had never explored, parks I had never visited during all the years when my free time was measured in minutes between Daniel's needs. The world was larger than I had remembered, full of possibilities I had stopped imagining when my dreams became exclusively about my son's future instead of my own. On one of these walks, I met Eleanor Rodriguez, a woman about my age who was sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons with the patient attention of someone who understood that small acts of kindness matter even when no one is watching. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and gray hair she wore in a neat bun, and when she smiled at me, it was the first genuinely warm smile from a stranger I had received in months. "They know me," she said, gesturing to the pigeons that gathered around her feet. "I come here every Tuesday and Friday. Same time, same bench. Consistency matters to them. They've learned to trust that I'll show up." We began talking, carefully at first, the way women our age do when we've learned to be cautious about revealing too much too soon. But there was something about Eleanor that invited honesty, and before I realized what I was doing, I found myself telling her about Daniel, about the slow dissolution of the relationship that had defined my entire adult life, about the bewildering discovery that the person you love most can simply decide you're no longer necessary. Eleanor listened without judgment or advice, nodding occasionally, making soft sounds of understanding that let me know she was truly hearing me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, watching the pigeons peck at the breadcrumbs around our feet. "My daughter lives in Seattle," she finally said. "Successful lawyer, beautiful family, life I helped make possible by working 3 jobs after her father left. She calls me twice a year, birthday and Christmas, and treats those calls like dental appointments. Necessary, but unpleasant." She turned to look at me directly, and I saw in her eyes the same bewildered hurt I recognized in my own mirror. I used to think there was something wrong with me, something I had done or failed to do that made her so eager to keep me at a distance. It took me years to understand that some people are just better at taking love than giving it, and that's not always the fault of the people who loved them. We sat together in comfortable silence, 2 women who had devoted ourselves to children, who had learned to see our devotion as evidence of our limitations rather than proof of our strength. But Eleanor carried herself with a dignity that suggested she had found peace with circumstances that might have broken someone else. "What changed?" I asked. "How did you learn to be okay with it?" Eleanor smiled, and this time her expression carried something I hadn't expected to see: genuine contentment. "I started living my own life instead of the life I thought a good mother should live. Turned out I was more than just someone's parent. Who knew?" That conversation planted something in me that grew slowly over the following weeks. I began to notice things about my life that I had accepted without question for so long they had become invisible. The way I still cooked meals, sized for 2 people, even though Daniel hadn't eaten at my table in months. The way I consulted an imaginary version of his opinion before making any decision, no matter how small. The way I had arranged my entire existence around being available for someone who was no longer interested in my availability. I started making changes. Small ones at first. Cooking meals I enjoyed regardless of whether Daniel would have liked them. Watching movies he would have found boring. Rearranging furniture to please my own sense of aesthetics rather than maintaining the home exactly as it had been when he lived there. Each change felt like a tiny revolution. A quiet declaration that my preferences mattered even when no one else was there to witness them. I bought flowers for myself, not for special occasions, but just because Tuesday morning felt like a good time for beauty. I painted my bedroom a soft lavender color that made me happy every time I walked into it, even though Daniel would have called it too feminine and suggested something more neutral. I joined a book club at the library, finding myself in conversations with women who saw me as Sophia first, not Daniel's mother, who happened to have other interests. They cared about my opinions on the novels we read, valued my insights, invited me to coffee not because they felt sorry for me, but because they enjoyed my company. For the first time in decades, I began to experience what it felt like to be chosen rather than needed, appreciated rather than taken for granted, seen rather than simply useful. The woman who emerged from this gradual awakening was someone I barely recognized but immediately liked. She had opinions that weren't shaped by what someone else might think. She made plans that didn't require anyone else's approval. She laughed at jokes that amused her regardless of whether they would amuse anyone else. She was, I realized with something approaching wonder, complete in herself. But I still loved Daniel. That hadn't changed and probably never would. Love like that doesn't disappear just because it stops being returned in the same measure. The difference was that I was no longer willing to make myself smaller to accommodate his comfort, no longer willing to accept crumbs of attention and pretend they constituted a feast. I began to understand that real love, the kind that actually serves the person being loved, sometimes requires boundaries, sometimes demands respect, sometimes insists on reciprocity not out of selfishness, but out of recognition that healthy relationships require participation from both sides. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with something much more powerful than rage: clarity. Crystal clear understanding of what I would and would not accept going forward, what I owed my son and what I owed myself, what love looked like when it included self-respect. I was no longer the woman who would disappear quietly to make room for other people's comfort. I was no longer the mother who would accept dismissal with grateful silence. I had something now that I hadn't possessed during all those years of devoted self-sacrifice. I had myself, and I was beginning to understand that this self was not a consolation prize, but the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The decision came to me on a Thursday morning in late spring, while I was watering the small garden I had started behind my house. Something about the way the sunlight fell across the tomato seedlings I had planted, delicate green shoots that would grow into something substantial if tended with patience, made me understand that it was time. Time to stop waiting for Daniel to remember who I was. Time to stop hoping that Alina would develop the capacity to see me as more than an inconvenient relic from her husband's past. Time to stop pretending that love could survive indefinitely without acknowledgement, respect, or reciprocation. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too hot, too consuming, too focused on what other people had done wrong. What I felt instead was something cooler and more purposeful. The quiet certainty of someone who had finally stopped accepting unacceptable treatment and decided to respond with the dignity that had been denied to her. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, the same yellow paper I had used for years to write shopping lists and plan birthday parties and organize the mundane details of a life centered around someone else's happiness. But today, I was planning something different. I wrote Daniel's full name at the top of the page: Daniel James Morrison. Below that, I began listing everything I could remember giving him over the past 33 years. Not just the obvious things: food, shelter, clothing, education, but the invisible gifts that had shaped him into the man he had become. Every night I had stayed awake when he was sick, measuring fever and offering comfort until dawn painted the windows gray. Every sacrifice I had made so he could have opportunities I had never imagined for myself. Every dream I had deferred, every want I had ignored, every piece of my own future I had gladly surrendered to ensure his would be bright and unlimited. The list grew longer than I had expected. 3 pages of memories I had never tallied before. Acts of love so constant they had become background music to our shared life, unnoticed until the music stopped and the silence revealed how much had been playing all along. But I wasn't making this list to guilt anyone or to prove a point about ingratitude. I was making it to remind myself of my own worth, to document the depth and consistency of love I had been capable of giving, to honor the woman who had devoted herself so completely to someone else's happiness that she had forgotten to value her own devotion. At the bottom of the 3rd page, I wrote something that surprised me with its simple truth: I have been an extraordinary mother. Whether Daniel chooses to acknowledge that or not doesn't change the fact. It only changes whether he gets to continue benefiting from it. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Margaret Holbrook had handled my divorce papers when Daniel's father died. Not because there was a divorce, but because there were legal matters to resolve when a spouse dies young and leaves behind complicated financial situations. She had been kind then, patient with my grief and confusion, and I hoped she would be equally understanding now. I want to change my will, I told her during our phone conversation, and I want to make some other legal arrangements. Can we meet next week? Margaret's voice was professionally neutral but warm. Of course, Sophia. May I ask what's prompting these changes? It helps me prepare the appropriate documents. I paused, choosing my words carefully. My relationship with my son has changed. I want to make sure my final arrangements reflect my current understanding of what's fair and appropriate. She didn't ask for details, for which I was grateful. Some stories are too long and too painful to summarize in professional conversations with people who are paid to solve problems rather than absorb sorrows. Margaret's office was in an old building downtown, filled with the kind of heavy wooden furniture that suggested permanence and tradition. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate the legal complexities of human relationships at their worst moments. "Let's start with what you currently have in place," she said, opening a file that contained documents I had signed years earlier, when Daniel was still young enough to need a guardian if something happened to me, when my primary concern was ensuring he would be provided for if I wasn't there to provide. Everything had been left to him, of course. My house, my modest savings account, my life insurance policy, even my jewelry and personal belongings. It had seemed natural then. Who else would I leave things to? He was my only family, my primary relationship, the person whose future mattered most to me. But looking at those documents now, I realized they told the story of a woman who had viewed herself as existing primarily to serve someone else's needs, even in death. Someone whose final act would be to give everything she had accumulated to a person who had made it clear that her presence in his life was more burden than blessing. "I want to make some significant changes," I told Margaret. "I want to leave the house to my friend Eleanor Rodriguez, who has become like a sister to me. I want my savings to go to the literacy program at the public library, where I've been volunteering. And I want to establish a small scholarship at the community college for women over 40 who are returning to education." Margaret took notes without comment, but I could see questions forming behind her careful professional expression. "What about Daniel?" she finally asked. "I want to make sure you've thought this through completely." "I'm leaving him something," I said, and pulled out the letter I had written the night before. "I want him to receive this, along with a check for exactly $5,000. The amount I spent on his wedding gift, which seemed appropriate since that was apparently when he decided to prioritize his new family over his old one." The letter had taken me 3 attempts to write. The first version had been too angry, full of recriminations and hurt feelings that would have sounded petty rather than dignified. The second had been too sad, a litany of self-pity that would have made Daniel feel guilty without helping him understand the consequences of his choices. The final version was something different entirely. It was the letter of a woman who had loved completely and been rejected systematically, who had finally chosen self-respect over endless patience. It was honest without being cruel, clear without being vindictive, final without being vengeful. "I also want to include some specific instructions," I continued. "The letter should be delivered exactly 1 year from today, along with copies of all the documents showing how I've distributed my estate. I want him to have time to understand what he's lost before he learns that the loss is permanent." Margaret looked up from her notes. "That's unusual. Most people want their final wishes communicated immediately after death." "I'm not dead yet," I said with a smile that felt foreign on my lips, because it carried no sadness, no apology, no attempt to soften difficult truths. "This isn't my deathbed last word. This is my living declaration of what I will and won't accept going forward. If Daniel wants to rebuild our relationship, he has a year to figure out how to do it. If he doesn't, well, then he'll understand exactly what his choices have cost him." Over the following days, I made other arrangements. I opened a new bank account and began transferring my savings, keeping only enough in our old joint account to cover basic expenses. I researched the organizations I wanted to support, meeting with directors and coordinators to understand how my modest contributions might make a difference in other people's lives. The literacy program coordinator was a young woman named Carmen, who lit up when I explained my desire to help women return to education later in life. "You have no idea how much this will mean," she said. "We have women in their 50s and 60s who want to finish degrees they started decades ago, but they can't afford the fees and books and supplies. Your scholarship will change lives. Change lives." The phrase stayed with me as I drove home, because I realized that was exactly what I was doing, changing my life, and potentially Daniel's, by refusing to continue patterns that had stopped serving anyone involved. Eleanor met me for coffee the following Tuesday, our weekly ritual that had become one of my most treasured routines. When I told her about my legal changes, about the house that would someday be hers if she wanted it, her eyes filled with tears. "Sophia, you don't have to do this. I don't want you making decisions based on anger or hurt." "I'm not," I assured her. "I'm making decisions based on love. Love for myself, which I'm finally learning to feel." Love for you, which has been one of the greatest gifts of this whole difficult experience. And yes, love for Daniel, which is why I'm giving him exactly 1 year to decide whether he wants a relationship with his mother or just her inheritance. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What if he doesn't choose you? I had asked myself the same question many times over the past few weeks, and each time the answer came back the same. Then I'll know I did everything I could, gave him every chance I could give, loved him as much as any mother can love a child. And I'll also know that I honored myself enough to stop accepting less than I deserved. The year ahead stretched before me like an empty canvas, 12 months during which Daniel could prove that our relationship mattered to him, or confirm that it didn't. Either way, I would finally have my answer. And more importantly, I would have myself, whole, dignified, and worthy of love, whether he chose to offer it or not. It was a Tuesday in October when the phone rang with the kind of urgency that cuts through ordinary afternoon quiet like a blade through silk. I was in my garden, harvesting the last tomatoes of the season, when I heard my phone buzzing insistently from the kitchen counter. Something in its persistence made me abandon my basket and hurry inside, dirt still under my fingernails. Autumn sunlight streaming through windows I had learned to appreciate for my own pleasure, rather than someone else's approval. "Mom?" Daniel's voice sounded strange, higher pitched than usual, strained in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child, calling me in the middle of the night after a bad dream. "Mom, I need to see you. Can I come over?" The question hung between us like something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. We hadn't spoken in 6 weeks, our longest stretch of silence since he had left for college 20 years earlier. I had stopped expecting his calls, had trained myself not to hope for contact that rarely came, and disappointed when it did. "Of course," I said, though something in his tone made me add, "Is everything all right? I need to talk to you. I'm leaving work now. I'll be there in an hour." He hung up before I could ask any more questions, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a dozen possibilities spinning through my mind. None of them were good. In my experience, emergency visits from adult children meant job loss, health scares, marriage troubles, or the kind of financial disasters that send people running back to the safety nets they had been taking for granted. I showered quickly and changed into clean clothes, then found myself tidying the house with nervous energy that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the habit of preparing spaces for Daniel's presence, even when that presence had become rare and precious as snow in summer. But as I moved through rooms that had grown comfortable in their solitude, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I wasn't cleaning for his approval anymore. I wasn't arranging flowers because I thought they might impress him or brewing coffee because I remembered his preferences. I was simply creating the kind of space where difficult conversations could happen with dignity, mine and his. When Daniel arrived, I saw immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way of minor setbacks or temporary disappointments, but wrong in the way that changes people permanently, the way earthquake cracks run deeper than surface damage would suggest. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from crying until there are no more tears left, only the hollow ache that follows emotional devastation. This wasn't the polished, successful man who had been embarrassed by my simple traditions and modest lifestyle. This was someone who had been broken down to his essential elements and discovered they weren't as strong as he had believed. "Daniel?" I opened the door wider, maternal instincts rising despite months of careful boundaries. "What's happened?" He stood on my doorstep for a long moment, looking at me as if he were seeing me for the first time in years, which I realized he probably was. For so long, I had been a convenient category in his life: mother, provider, supporter, the person who was always there and therefore could be safely ignored. Now he was looking at me as if I were a person with feelings and worth, and the power to choose whether or not to help him. "She's gone," he said finally, the words falling out of him like stones from a broken wall. "Alina's gone. She left this morning, took half our bank account and all her stuff and just left." I stepped back to let him enter, watching him move through my living room with the uncertain steps of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. He had been in this house thousands of times, but suddenly he seemed like a stranger trying to remember where he belonged, if he belonged at all. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Whatever anger or hurt I carried toward Alina, I had never wanted Daniel to experience the kind of abandonment I had learned to recognize in his hollow eyes and defeated posture. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" He collapsed onto my couch. The same modest couch he had once implied was embarrassing, now apparently adequate for his reduced circumstances, and put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his face was older than I remembered, marked by the kind of disillusionment that ages people in ways that have nothing to do with time. "I found out she's been cheating on me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For months, maybe since before our wedding. With her boss, with someone from her gym, probably others. I confronted her yesterday, and she didn't even try to deny it. She just laughed and said she was tired of pretending I was enough for her." The words hit me with surprising force, not because I was shocked by Alina's cruelty. I had sensed her capacity for coldness from our first meeting, but because I recognized the particular pain in Daniel's voice, the bewilderment of someone discovering that the person they loved saw them as fundamentally insufficient. "She said I was boring," Daniel continued, tears finally coming, the kind of tears that carry years of accumulated hurt and confusion. "She said marrying me was a mistake, that she only did it because she thought I had more potential than I actually have. She said I was too attached to my past, too sentimental about things that don't matter, too willing to settle for less than I deserve." Each phrase landed like an echo of conversations I remembered from our kitchen table months earlier, when Alina had used similar language to dismiss our traditions, our history, our love, as somehow inadequate for sophisticated people with elevated standards. "She took everything, Mom. The furniture, the wedding gifts, even the coffee maker. And the money. She cleaned out our savings account, maxed out the credit cards, left me with nothing but debt and an apartment full of empty rooms." I sat down beside him, not too close, not presuming intimacy that hadn't been rebuilt yet, but close enough to offer comfort if he wanted to receive it. The mother in me wanted to pull him against my shoulder the way I had when he was small, and the world had proven too harsh for his tender heart. But the woman I had become over the past year understood that some lessons could only be learned through experience. Some growth could only happen through consequences. "I keep thinking about what she said about my past," Daniel went on, his voice breaking, "about being too sentimental, too attached to things that don't matter. And I realized, God, Mom, I realized she was talking about you, about us, about everything I grew up thinking was important. The admission hung between us like a bridge that might hold our weight or might collapse under the pressure of too much honesty too late. She made me feel like loving you was somehow pathetic," he continued, finally meeting my eyes. "Like being close to my mother was evidence that I wasn't really a man, that I hadn't grown up properly. She convinced me that successful people don't maintain those kinds of emotional connections to their childhood, that I needed to choose between having a sophisticated adult life and being tied to my past." I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Daniel hadn't rejected me because he had stopped loving me. He had rejected me because someone he loved had convinced him that loving me was a weakness, that loyalty was limitation, that the very qualities that made him a good son somehow made him a lesser man. "So I chose her," he said, and his voice carried the weight of complete regret. "I chose what I thought was my future over what I knew was my foundation. I threw away the one relationship in my life that had never asked me to be anything other than myself, the one person who loved me before I accomplished anything, before I proved I was worthy, before I became someone impressive enough to deserve love." The tears came harder now, years of suppressed guilt and growing awareness finally finding expression. And now she's gone, and I have nothing. No marriage, no savings, no home, no self-respect. But worse than that, I don't have you anymore either. I don't have the one person who might have helped me through this, because I was stupid enough to trade unconditional love for conditional approval. I reached over and took his hand, the same hand I had held while teaching him to tie his shoes, while walking him to school on his first day, while comforting him through childhood heartbreaks that had seemed enormous then but were nothing compared to the adult devastation he was experiencing now. "You still have me," I said quietly. "You've always had me. That never changed. even when you couldn't see it. Daniel looked at me with something approaching wonder, as if my presence was a miracle he hadn't dared hope for. But I hurt you so badly. I chose her over you, dismissed everything you meant to me, treated you like you were embarrassing instead of essential. How can you even stand to look at me? I was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something I was still learning to understand myself. Because you're my son, I said finally. And because real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, doesn't disappear just because it's not returned in the same measure. It doesn't vanish just because someone makes mistakes or gets confused about what's important. But I don't deserve forgiveness, Daniel said, his voice carrying the particular anguish of someone who had finally understood the magnitude of their error. No, I agreed, and watched his face crumple with fresh pain. You don't deserve forgiveness. But that's what makes it grace instead of transaction. That's what makes it love instead of commerce. The months that followed Daniel's return were nothing like our old relationship, and everything like what a real relationship should have been. We didn't slip back into the comfortable patterns of mother-provider and son-receiver that had defined our interactions for so many years. Instead, we built something new, something based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation, on chosen connection rather than biological expectation. Daniel moved back into his childhood bedroom temporarily, not because I offered, but because he asked. And not because he assumed I would say yes, but because he understood that my help was a gift rather than a given. He paid me rent from his reduced salary. He had lost his prestigious job along with his marriage, Alina having spread enough poison through their social circle that his professional reputation suffered collateral damage from their personal collapse. But something beautiful happened in that small room with its faded baseball posters and shelves of books he had outgrown years earlier. Daniel rediscovered parts of himself that Alina had convinced him were childish weaknesses to be abandoned. He remembered that he had once loved reading poetry, that he found genuine joy in simple pleasures like afternoon walks and homemade meals, that sophistication was not the same thing as happiness. I forgot who I was, he told me one evening as we sat on the back porch, watching fireflies dance above the garden I had taught him to tend. Or maybe I never really knew who I was, because I was so busy trying to become who I thought I should be. We talked more in those months than we had in the previous 5 years combined. Not the careful, surface-level conversations that had characterized our relationship during his marriage, but real discussions about life, disappointment, the difference between love and possession, the way pain can teach you things that comfort never could. Daniel learned to cook simple meals, not because he had to, but because he wanted to contribute something to our shared life. He helped me with repairs around the house, fixed the squeaky door that had been bothering me for years, painted the fence that separated our yard from the neighbors. Small acts of care that felt enormous because they were chosen rather than expected, given rather than demanded. He met Eleanor, who welcomed him with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with his relationship to me, and everything to do with her recognition that he was genuinely trying to become a better person. She told him stories about her own daughter, about the long years of waiting for acknowledgement that might never come, about the peace that comes from loving people without needing them to love you back in the same measure. Your mother saved my life, Eleanor told him during one of our Tuesday coffee meetings that had expanded to include him. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but by showing me that friendship could be as deep and sustaining as family, that chosen relationships could be as meaningful as blood ones. Daniel listened with the attention of someone who was finally learning to hear stories that weren't about him, but could teach him about himself. He was discovering that the world was full of people who had wisdom to offer, experiences to share, perspectives that could expand his understanding of what mattered and why. 6 months after his return, Daniel got a new job, not as prestigious as his previous position, not as well paid, but with a company whose values aligned with the person he was becoming rather than the person he had been trying to be. His boss was a woman in her 50s who had built her business on principles of integrity and community service, who valued character over charisma and substance over style. She reminds me of you, Daniel told me after his first week. The way she treats people with respect, regardless of their title or salary. The way she remembers personal details about employees' families. The way she makes the office feel like a place where people matter as individuals. not just as productivity units. It was the first time in years that Daniel had compared someone favorably to me, and I felt something in my chest loosen and expand like a flower finally receiving sunlight after a long winter. 8 months after Alina left, we established new traditions. Not the old ones. Those belonged to a different version of ourselves, a mother and son who had loved each other without really knowing each other. These new rituals were born from mutual choice and sustained by genuine affection. Sunday morning coffee on the back porch, where we read different sections of the newspaper and shared interesting articles, where we planned the week ahead and reflected on the week behind. Wednesday evening walks through the neighborhood, routes that took us past Eleanor's house for impromptu visits, past the library where I had volunteered and he had started helping with literacy classes. We cooked together on Friday nights, trying new recipes and sharing stories from our separate weeks, learning about each other as individuals rather than as extensions of each other. Daniel discovered that I had opinions about books and movies and politics that had nothing to do with his preferences, that I was a person with interests and dreams that existed independently of his needs. "I never asked you about your own life," he said one evening, his voice carrying the particular sadness that comes from recognizing your own selfishness too late to undo its effects. "All those years, all those conversations, and I never asked what you wanted, what you dreamed about, what you hoped for yourself. You were young," I said, though we both knew that youth alone didn't excuse decades of self-absorption. "You're asking now. That's what matters." The first anniversary of Alina's departure passed quietly, marked only by Daniel's observation that he felt grateful for the pain that had brought him home to himself, and to me. "I wouldn't choose to go through it again," he said. "But I can't regret something that taught me the difference between what I thought I wanted and what I actually needed." It was 2 weeks later that Margaret Holbrook called to remind me about the letter and documents I had asked her to deliver exactly 1 year after our meeting. In all the healing and rebuilding of the past months, I had almost forgotten about the legal arrangements I had made, the ultimatum I had given Daniel without his knowledge. "Do you still want me to deliver these?" Margaret asked. "Given the changes in your relationship, you might want to reconsider the timing or the content." I thought about the letter I had written, the will that left everything to people and organizations other than my son, the clear message that his choices had consequences that couldn't be undone simply by returning home. Then I thought about the man Daniel had become over the past year, the genuine remorse he had shown, the consistent effort he had made to rebuild not just our relationship but his own character. "Yes," I said finally. "He needs to understand the full cost of what he almost lost, and I need him to know that rebuilding our relationship doesn't erase the consequences of destroying it. Some lessons are only learned when you understand how close you came to losing everything that mattered." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier while Daniel was at work. I found it propped against the front door when I returned from my grocery shopping, official and final-looking in its legal envelope. I left it on the kitchen table where Daniel would see it immediately when he came home, then went about my normal afternoon routine of tending the garden and preparing dinner. Daniel found the letter at 6:30, his face going pale as he recognized Margaret Holbrook's return address. "Mom!" he called, his voice carrying the edge of panic. "There's a letter here from your lawyer." "I know," I said from the kitchen, where I was stirring soup that smelled like comfort and forgiveness and new beginnings. "It's for you. You should read it." I heard the envelope tear, heard pages rustling, heard the long silence that meant Daniel was absorbing words I had written during the worst period of our relationship, when I had been forced to choose between my dignity and my devotion, and had finally learned they didn't have to be mutually exclusive. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, he was holding the papers against his chest like armor, his eyes red with tears that looked different from the tears he had cried when Alina left. These were tears of gratitude mixed with grief, relief mixed with regret. "You were going to leave everything to other people," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The house, your savings, even your jewelry. You were going to write me out of your life completely. I was going to leave you exactly what your behavior indicated you valued from me," I corrected gently. $5,000 and a clear understanding of what you had chosen to discard. "But I came back," Daniel said. and something in his tone suggested he was still trying to process the magnitude of what he had almost lost. I realized my mistake. I apologized. I changed. Doesn't that count for something? I turned from the stove to look at my son, this man who had hurt me more deeply than anyone else ever had, who had also loved me more consistently than anyone else ever had, who was finally learning that love and respect were not separate things, but different aspects of the same commitment. It counts for everything, I said. That's why you're here, why we're having this conversation, why we have a relationship to rebuild. But Daniel, you need to understand that some bridges, once burned, can only be rebuilt, not restored. What we have now is better than what we had before, but it's also more fragile, more precious, and more dependent on choices we make every single day. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding finally settling into his features like sunlight filling a room that had been dark too long. I almost lost you completely, he said. Not just our relationship, but you. I almost lost the person who loved me first and longest and most completely, and I would have deserved it. But you didn't lose me, I said, moving to embrace the son who had finally learned to value what he had never had to earn. You found your way back to me, and more importantly, you found your way back to yourself. That's worth more than any inheritance, more than any tradition, more than any mistake you've made or any hurt you've caused. As we held each other in my small kitchen, surrounded by the smell of homemade soup and the sound of evening settling over our neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete contentment. Not the desperate satisfaction of being needed, but the quiet joy of being chosen. Not the anxious love of someone who feared abandonment, but the secure affection of someone who knew her worth and wouldn't accept less than she deserved. I had learned, finally, that love without respect is not love at all, but dependency wearing love's clothes. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be taken for granted. Refuse to accept crumbs when you deserve the whole feast. Refuse to disappear quietly when you deserve to be celebrated loudly. Most importantly, I had learned that I was more than just someone's mother. I was Sophia, complete, valuable, worthy of love in my own right, capable of creating a meaningful life whether or not anyone else chose to be part of it. And Daniel had learned that some gifts, once discarded, are not guaranteed to be offered again. That love, however unconditional, still requires respect to thrive. That the people who love you most are often the people you can hurt most easily, but also the people most worth protecting from your own capacity for thoughtless cruelty. Together, we had learned that the strongest relationships are not the ones that never break, but the ones that can be rebuilt with wisdom gained through breaking, reinforced with appreciation earned through loss, and sustained by the daily choice to value what you have been given the grace to reclaim. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.